Okay. Now, in the previous session, we had discussed about Java data types. Right. Now, let's discuss about Java variables. Now, what we thought of Java variables. So, Java variables are nothing but it's a container, right, which is used to store information of a given type. What is a type here means to store the data into variable, we have to specify a type of variable. What type of variable we are going to declare. So according to the type of data type, it stores that relevant information. Right? Each variable in Java have a specific data type, right? Like we see in the previous session, integer has some specific data type. It is a integer, and string. It is a separate data type, and double, long, float, byte, bit, like that. So each variable has its own specific type, and which determines which the size and the layout of the variable in the memory, and the range is depending on the size we have declared the data type variable. For example, let's say now if you take a string, now string it store the type is string values like keywords, some words in the double quotes. Like integer, it store only pure numeric values, and double it store a decision or no decimal values, like that. So we'll talk about in detail in the later sections, right? So Java variables are nothing but just simply it is a kind of container, means it is holding, means it's a holder, data holder, which hold the data according to the given type that we have declared, right? So once we declare that type of variable, then we start initializing those variables. First, let's see that there is one confusion to everybody. What is the declaration and initialization? So both are different. If you could see this one, right? Now, int x, this, now I have just declared a variable. So this we called as a declaration. This is called as a declaration, means you are declaring, means you are giving data type, means we declare the data type. What type of data? It has supposed to hold that integer x, and x is going to store the values of type integer. So we just declare the variable. Next thing is initialization is nothing but once you declare the variable, here you have to start initializing the variable. Means I'm just initializing the variable x equals to 10. This is called as initialization. So there is interview question will ask that what is the declaration and initialization of variable. Declaration of variable is to declare the type of variable of type, which type of data it's going to hold that in our data operations during our program execution. Initialization is nothing but to initialize the values, initial values, or at, before it start executing the logic. No matter you keep changing this in values later also. This is just initializing. Now we more said declaration and initialization is just in x equals to 5. This is called as declaring and initializing at the same time. You could see, means it is a combination, these two combine, and declaration and initialization equals to declaration and initialization. Means I have declared the variable at the same time I have initialized the variable. I initialize the variable x equals to 5. This is called as declared and initialized, and there is a separate thing called declaration. You just declared, but you have not assigned any value to this holder integer x, and here you are initializing. Okay, hope you are clear with declaration and initialization. Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay, now let's go back to the type of variables. In this Java, we mainly have three kinds of variables. One is local variable, instance variable, class, or we can call it also a static variables. So let's discuss in brief about this one by one. First, go with the class local variables. So in Java, when we are writing a program, right, we may use different scope of variables, right? Static variables we are using, local variables we are using, instance variable we are using. But why we have different types of variables? When to use that? Where to use that exactly? That that is the need of this session. Now, let's talk about local variables. Local variables, what it means say locally. Let's you see, just take an example of for real-time example, right? We are saying local candidates, right? Outside candidates like that, right? So local means that belongs to one locality. So their scope is within that. They cannot exist outside, right? So instance variables means outside of this local, they can have access to in local and as well as outside. The same way here, local variables also, right? They are declared within this blocks or constructors or methods. In general, we are using these variables inside methods, blocks, constructors only. We don't have any other scope, right? So, but the way of we are sending the values to methods, constructors, and blocks is depending on our programming logic. So the scope of the various local variables lies within the method and constructor or a block, which means when your block or a method constructor execute, then its live gets starts, means it then only it start live, it start executing this program, right? When that particular method is called or when that constructor is called, the local variables will come into picture. When that method or a constructor block is completed execution, then their life will be destroyed, which means the local variables are created when the method, constructor, or a block is entered, and it will be destroyed once it exists that particular constructor, method, or a block, which means it is like a short-lived variables. You cannot have long time. I mean, no one can refer outside from that particular method to another method. Means the variable declared within one method as right cannot be accessed outside of another method. Because as we discussing, right, these are bound to a specific method at a constructor at a block, and the rules is that you cannot apply access modifiers for local variables, which means like private publics, right? Like this protected, you cannot apply these access modifiers, and there is no default values for local variables, and so local variables should be declared and initialized before the use, means before the first use, means before you start executing your logic, programming logic in that particular method or constructor, make sure the values should be declared and initialized. As we see in right, declaration and initialization means this is what that means. Make sure the value should be available like this. What type of values you are going to store that as integer, string, anything, just make sure it should be declared and initialized. So these are all the rules about the Java local variables. Now let's see some hands-on examples on this. Let's go and create one class called Java variables. Oh, write a main method. Okay, this is the standard main method to run our program. Now, what's our intention? We are discussing about the Java local variables. Now so let's start writing one method. Now before we go for that, where and all it is applicable? It is applicable on constructors, methods, and blocks. What types of blocks? Is a static blocks. Let's say one by one. Let's first go with method. Public void, can say add numbers. Okay. Now here we are not going to pass any parameters. We just declare and initialize those values inside the method. Now x comma x equals to 10. Now you can say x comma y equals to 10. Int, sorry, z equals to x plus y. Value of z. Now you are going to print this value here. So now this is where how we use this local variable. It means we have to declare and initialize these variables and use within this method. Now let's write one more method and try to access this outside. Let's public void, okay, multiply. Now what we're trying to do, just int z equals to, I'm trying to say x into y. You could see you get a compilation error, right? It is expecting x cannot be resolved to a type variable and say y also cannot be resolved to a variable, means it is not able to identify where you have used these variables, where you have declared and initialized these variables. You are trying to expect to multiply of these two numbers, but the compiler doesn't know where these variables are exist. So that is the reason. So these variables, which the local variables which are used in one method, cannot be accessible to the outside of another method, which means their scope is within that method or constructor or a block only. So once it start declaring and slicing here, once you are done with this, right, then this will be ended with that life, which means you cannot have further access outside once you are done with the current method execution. The same thing is applicable to the constructor also. For example, let's create one constructor here. Say Java variables, right? Now I create a constructor Java variables. Now this is how we call constructor with this syntax. Means constructors are called while creating objects. Let's create a constructor. The same logic we use here. Then I go with the different values. Okay. Now this is different and this is different. Or we can say something A equals to 10 and B equals to 10. And let's go C. A, B. Now you try to access these variables here. Now A plus Y. You could not find this. A is unable to resolve this. You cannot find this A where it is exactly this, because this is bound to this constructor context. You cannot have access to this constructor, and you cannot have access to this local variables that are declared in constructor. So their scope is within that current bounded context only. You cannot access outside of this. So this is why we are saying their life starts within that method, constructor or block, and ends once that particular method constructor is complete execution. Let's talk, write one block of code. What is that? It's a static block. Save and static block also. See here how. So this is how we can declare methods, blocks, and constructors. Now, as we see in that, right, if you don't initialize and declare this variable at the first use, what we could say exception. Now, have removed this one. What you see this exception? Local variable X may not have been initialized. The default values will not work, as we know that integer default value it be 0, but however we have to explicitly initialize this value, right? Just declaring the value will not help in the local variables. Local variables always to be initialized, explicitly initialized, means you can initialize with the default values also before their use. So that is the rule for the local variables. You must have to initialize that values before you use in the logic. Now let's call all these methods and say, now to call this method, say Java variables dot add of numbers. And you no need to call this static block, because the static blocks are all automatically called when the class is loaded. We'll discuss in detail about this static context in the upcoming session. Let's see the value of Z and constructor values and value of Z. Oh, this make confusion. This is static. Okay, see this. The value of static is 20, and the constructor variables thus, and this add numbers. And also you could see the order of execution is that the way of we have declared methods and we call is not happen. Why? Because the static blocks or static methods will be called first when you run your program. So that is the preference, that give the preference to first static blocks, then static methods, and then constructors, and then instance method. Why after constructor then instance method, right? First, when you create object, based on that object, from that object only we are calling the method. So before it call the method, your constructor is already invoked. Then when it once it is create the object, then by using that object you are calling the instance methods. So that is the reason it takes this order. So you are clear about this static sorry instance variables. Then we'll jump into the local variables. We are done. Now go to the instance variables. Now, what is the instance variables? It is reverse, or it is opposite to the local variables. Instance variables are declared within the class, which means here now this is the class name. It should be declared within this class, but outside of the constructors, methods, or blocks. It should be accessible to any of the method. Means once we declare the variables inside the class, the methods, constructors, static blocks, static math, no matter what type of methods they are and blocks, right? They should be able to access those variables in those blocks. right? Instance variables are created when an object is created with the help of keyword new. As we seen that with the moment you create an object, right, using new keyword, the instance variables get start creating that. Otherwise it will not be, it does not have any life get started. Once this new keyword is available, then instance variable start initializing, and when that object is destroyed, then instance variable will be go on. Destroy in the sense nothing but we have to deallocate the memory to that object. How do we do that? We see that during hands-on. Okay. Our instance variables can be declared in class level before and after use also. When with that, say once you have a variables declared in this class, any class that extend this class still have access to this variables. In for this, it is reverse and opposite to that of local variables. As told, right, local variables cannot have any access modifiers. Here in this instance, variables can have access modifiers, like you can have private, public access modifiers. And instance variables have a default values. Means for the numbers, as you see that, right, for integers, its default value is 0, for boolean false, and for string it stores null. You no need to explicitly initialize these values for this instance variables during declaration or within the constructor, right? Instance variables can be directly accessed by calling that variable name inside the class, which means once you declare the variables inside this class, no matter which method you are going to use that instance variables, let's just say instance variable name and call that one. If anyone change the value from outside and that other guy accessing that, right, he will get that instance variable that is get updated. Now let's see some hands-on examples. Now the same thing we do is we'll just remove everything from here. Now this time you see this, we are getting exception, right? Variable z cannot be resolved, means it is not there in our class. Now as we discussed, right, instance variables are declared or initialized within the class but outside of the methods or constructors or blocks. So soon after the class is created, right, this is the first place and the first line that we have to initialize this. Now you see this one, it's coming as with the blue mark, which means, right, it is outside. Now you see this error is there. Why? See, may cannot make a static reference to a non-static field. Okay, this we'll discuss it later in detail about the static context. Let's now remove this one, as because this only in the static context we'll have access related to static only. If you change this static, right, then it start working. See this one. See, I will cover in detail in this later section. No worry. Now we have the constructor. Now in the constructor, I just say change a z is already there. X, or no need to have anything. Just directly we can just now say this. What I'm going to do this, I'm going to say x plus y. Here see, I have initialized and declared the value. Say declared and initialized the values here itself at the class level. Here I just computing my logic. What my logic is, adding of two numbers in the constructors. At the same way, in the method also, I just call this one, right, z. Here also I will use the same logic, right? Instead of add numbers, right, x minus y. Okay, we can say a difference within this time. Now this where time we're going to find the difference of these two numbers. Now here I have not declare these variables here again, not initialize this. Means the values which are declared and initialized outside of our methods inside our class can be accessed across everywhere. Let's see this one in the constructor also, you are able to access this one. Then this method also, the same variables. You cannot have any compile time error. You just run this program, you could see the output of this one. The constructor variables 20. Here we have added some of these two numbers, and this diff numbers is then x minus y is 0 because 10 minus 10 is 0. Now, this is how this instance variables works. I was told, right, instance variable directly access, right? Now, this print one um, instance variable here, right? Say instance variable. Here I can directly print the Z also here. No matter where you call. Okay, but this is a static. Now again, this is the same problem. We cannot have this one. Okay, instead that, then do this and put it in our instance method. Now this instance variable Z x plus y automatically access and print your output here. You can also initialize these variables through constructor. For that, you have to write a parameter constructor to update these values. Every time if you are expecting a different set of values, right, you can have a different parameter constructors. When the same constructor with two parameters, you can keep changing the values, right? It is a real-time scenario. We will be keep updating the values x equals to y. It is not a always fixed values. Here you can remove these two values and pass from the constructor. So every time you can say 10, 10, 5, 2, 6, 7, something so on, right? From the business perspective, right? These values will be dynamic. Real-time scenarios, no one will be go with the hard coded like this. But there are certain scenarios, right, where you want to start with the default value. If that value does not exist, or if no one is passing the values at the time of program execution, if the value is not available, if instead of taking the default value of that particular data type, integer default value is 0, instead of taking 0, it will take the default initialization value. Means explicitly what value we have initialized, that value will be considered as default value and it will go ahead. Let's see now, rather as could say instance variables, this printing. So this is how instance variable will be worked out. Now the same instance variable can be accessible to the outside of this class also, but there is a limit that can be achieved using inheritance concept that we'll cover in later in the next session. Now let's go back to the next type of variable is static variables. What's this class or static variables? In general, we call it just static variables. The static variables are the variables which we are declaring with the static, which means those are data types only, integer, string, double, all these, but we are marking, we are updating those variables as static, which means this variable integer is an integer type which hold the integer, but this should be a static. Means it should hold the data in at like class level. That is we call as a static variable. Static variables can be accessed and it is only one copy is available to everybody in the same class. Okay, now let's see, there could be only one copy of each class variable per class regardless of how many objects are created from it. Means like that, now how many objects are you are creating, right? That you have a number of objects in the instance, and if you say the variable is declared as static, then the same copy is available to all the objects that you are declared here. Then it is class level. When this will be created, when the program starts, right? Then when the program ends, which means their life is that, like instance where like local variables, their scope is within the method. Like that, static variables also have a scope. When this program is alive, the static variables will be still holding that, right? No matter whether you are using this class or not, but this is live in the scope. Once this execution of this program completed, means it terminate and it's not used anymore, this static scope will be ended. And the static variables can be accessed in two ways. Well, directly you can call with the class name, or you can even call with the method where object also. When declaring a class variables, right, you should make sure that you have to follow some naming conventions like a public, static, final, and the constant name with the caps and the upper cases, right? Then you give a value, means assign initialize the value. This is the standard when where we are using the serial time scenario. This public static void main as the standard syntax for static variables, as these are one time initialization, right? So they're following some standard, that's the naming syntax. And the visibility is similar to instance variables, but here static variables are declared public since they must be available for use of the classes, right? And same way for static variables also have the default values, as we discussed previously. Depending on the data type we are using, the default values will be allocated, whether it is integer, float, double, boolean, string. So according to the data type, it takes the default values. Now let's see that the same thing now. The same examples will update with this static. Now let's see, I say static. Now static x equals to z, say 10, y equals 10. Now here I will update as static. In previous examples, right, in previous video, we are not able to access this z here in this, right here. When we try to print this value, right, we are not able to access. Now we can access that because now you are in the static context. Stress this main is a static, right? Public static wideband. Main is the static method. Then that is the reason you are able to access this one. You just remove this static keyword, right, and see that you are not able to access this, right? See here back. One point to remember here, right, as we are discussing about the static, right, in this static methods are accessible here in this static methods, but however in the instance method also we still access, which means static context will be accessible in the instance method, but the same instance variables cannot be referred to the static method. Let's take an example, right? One variable a equals to 22. Okay, now this is non-static variable. Okay, now if I try to access this a here, you cannot access that. Compiler will give error. Say this one. See, b cannot be resolved to a variable, which means see it is not a static, it is an instance variable. See, that is the reverse of static. Instance variables are accessible to only instance method, and they cannot have access to static access. This static context is totally different. So that is the reason only static variables can be accessed within the static context. But in the static variables can be accessed inside the instance methods or constructors also, right? So you just see, don't confuse here. Instance, the static variables can be accessed only within the static context. Instance variables are accessed in the instance methods, but they will not have access to static methods, static context. But static variables can be accessed inside instance method. See, Z is the static variables, right? I still have access to this. I told you, right? Why these instance variables are not accessible to static methods? Here, this object creation is not still happen. When this object creation is happen, then only this life will get started. When this start working, that is the reason this instance variables will not be accessible to the static context. The static context related will be loaded first before the object is created, as we seen in the previous example, right? First, the static block, static methods gets called, then constructor is calling, then instance variables. Okay, that we'll see in the next static context discussion, right? No worry. Up to here, we will stop discussing that. Then we move to the hands-on. Now, let's see the run this program. You could say this one. Say exact output. The only difference between the instance and variables is that, right, both are outside of this class, right? But their accessing of variables depend on the context. The context of this variables is static, so you should be able to access those in the static context, right? Now you see this one, you are directly calling this, right? Here, this one, if you want to call these methods outside of this class, then how you call? You say class name dot that variable. How do you do this, right? Let's see the class name in the sense, see Java variables dot, you could see X, Y, Z. All these variables are accessible just like that. But now let's say the int A is an instance variable. You could see here A is not available, which means you cannot call the instance variable with the help of class. That is the reason we called as a class level variables. Means using class you can access the static variables, but instance variables cannot be accessed using class. Those are instance. There's not a class level that have its own copy. It has a single copy, right? Once you declare this, initialize this variable, the same copy of variables will be accessible across your entire program, entire Java class. But instance variables are not like that. Every time you keep changing. For my request, I'm sending 22. For other guy 20, other guy 5, 10. So this instance will keep changing, which means it take the values dynamically. But static values is not like that. For example, the static value initially it takes 20. Now later, when I go and access that program, I could still see 20 only. If I change the value 20 to 100, the other guy who is accessing the same static variables can see 100, because one copy of variable is available to an entire class. So the static variable is the variable which will be accessed to entire class level. So only one copy of this, no matter even if we are trying to create the object n number of times also, it doesn't make sense to the static. Right? But instance variables are not like that. Each copy is different for each user request. One user can see 20, another user can see 100, right? Depending on their values that are updating. But static is reverse. If I update the value static, some value to another value 10 to 20, other person also can see the updated value. If that guy update the value, I could see the same value, which means wherever we want to maintain the same value across the flow, right? Then we go for static. Instance variables are per instance requests. So this is all about our Java variables. In the next session, we'll start looking at the operators, Java operators in depth. Right now, we'll end up this session. For first 40 minutes, this will be disconnected.